Breaking news. This did not begin as a routine trade dispute. It started with an accusation so bold and so deliberate that within hours, it began shaking one of the strongest partnerships in the world today. The United States has officially launched a forced labor investigation targeting Canada. Let that fully register. Not China, not a sanctioned state, Canada. And what followed caught nearly everyone in Washington off guard. Mark Carney did not remain quiet. He did not retreat into private negotiations. He stepped forward publicly, and the words he used, along with the steps he is now taking, could turn this into the most serious US Canada confrontation in generations. Stay with me, because the deeper you look into this, the clearer the real stakes become. This is not truly about labor standards. It is about power, leverage, and a calculated strategy that could reshape North American trade in real time. Let's walk through the sequence because timing is critical here. 72 hours ago, the U.S. Commerce Department initiated a formal investigation under Section 307 of the Tariff Act. The focus: Canadian aluminum, softwood lumber, and agricultural products. The stated reason: potential links to forced labor. On the surface, it looks like standard procedure, routine oversight. But examine it more closely and the narrative begins to unravel. Canada is not typically associated with labor abuse controversies. In fact, by most global benchmarks, Canada exceeds the United States in worker protections, union strength, and wage standards. So why target Canada? Why now? This is where it begins to feel uneasy. This investigation did not emerge out of nowhere. It followed weeks of increasingly sharp remarks from Donald Trump, who has repeatedly framed Canada as an economic threat in recent appearances. He did not stop at trade imbalances. He went further, suggesting that Canadian industries were harming American workers through what he described as questionable labor practices. That phrasing matters because just 2 weeks later, officials within his administration began echoing it. Soon after, reports surfaced about internal discussions on tighter supply chain scrutiny focused on Canadian goods. And now, the full investigation rests on that very foundation. But here's the detail that changes everything. Multiple insiders familiar with closed-door trade discussions suggest that this investigation may not actually be intended to prove forced labor exists. Instead, it may be designed to create enough uncertainty to disrupt Canadian exports at a critical moment, just ahead of the 2026 USMCA review. Consider the timing. Canadian aluminum producers rely heavily on U.S. markets. Softwood lumber is deeply tied to American housing construction. Agricultural goods move across the border daily in both directions. You do not need to prove wrongdoing to cause damage. Simply raising the possibility is enough. Once uncertainty appears, buyers hesitate. Shipments are delayed, contracts are reconsidered, supply chains begin shifting, and the impact starts long before any official finding is made. That is exactly what is happening now. Within 48 hours of the announcement, Canadian exporters began noticing hesitation from U.S. partners. Some orders were paused, others were quietly redirected. Billions in trade did not disappear, but it slowed just enough to create real pressure. And in trade politics, pressure is a powerful tool. It forces a response. It puts the other side in a position where doing nothing looks like weakness. But Washington appears to have miscalculated the reaction. They expected a controlled response, a formal note, quiet negotiations. That is how previous Canadian governments handled disputes. Careful, measured, behind closed doors. This time was different. This time the response came from Mark Carney. And within hours, he shifted the entire tone. Carney did not simply reject the allegations, he reframed them. In a statement that spread rapidly across global media, he accused the United States of using human rights language as a tool for economic pressure. There was no softening, no ambiguity. He described it directly as a politically motivated move designed to mask trade restrictions behind ethical claims. Then he went a step further. He turned the focus back toward the United States. Because here's the uncomfortable reality that makes this situation so volatile. The United States operates a prison labor system that, under its own laws, allows inmates to work for very low wages. This is not speculation. It is an established system. And Carney used that fact not as rhetoric, but as a legal counterpoint. If the United States is willing to investigate forced labor, then Canada can apply the same standard to American imports. That is the moment this stopped being a one-sided investigation and became the potential beginning of a real trade conflict. Now the situation is moving into new territory. Beyond public statements and headlines, both sides are quietly preparing their next steps. Legal teams are mobilizing. Trade analysts are modeling scenarios. Businesses on both sides of the border are bracing for disruption. And one key detail remains: none of this has formally escalated yet. No tariffs have been imposed. No final rulings have been issued. Everything happening now is part of the buildup before a possible breaking point. So the real question is not what has already happened. The real question is what comes next. Here is where this shifts from political tension to strategic maneuvering. What Mark Carney did next was not just defensive. It was a calculated counter move, aimed exactly where Washington may not have expected. Within hours of the U.S. announcement, Carney authorized preparations for Canada to launch its own formal review of American imports. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, a real legal process focused on U.S. agricultural goods and their potential connection to prison labor systems. Think about that. The same legal framework the United States used against Canada is now being applied in reverse. That changes everything because the United States did not just open an investigation, it set a precedent. And precedents apply both ways. This matters because the U.S. prison labor system is documented. More than 800,000 inmates participate in work programs across multiple industries. In some cases, those goods enter commercial markets. The moment Canada begins examining whether any of those products reach its borders, the conversation shifts completely. It moves from claims to evidence. It becomes about verification. And that reveals the deeper strategy. Carney is not reacting emotionally. He is positioning the United States in a situation where continuing the investigation becomes legally and politically complicated, because moving forward invites equal scrutiny of American practices. And that is not the end of the response. At the same time, Canada is preparing to challenge the investigation under the USMCA agreement. This is a formal legal process that could lead to authorized retaliation. If Canada triggers Chapter 31, it begins a dispute panel that will determine whether the U.S. action violates trade rules. And if Canada wins, it gains the legal right to impose counter-tariffs. These would not be symbolic measures. They would target key American industries: steel, automobiles, agriculture, sectors that rely heavily on Canadian markets could face immediate consequences. And unlike political retaliation, these actions would be backed by the same agreement the United States helped establish. Now consider the pressure building behind the scenes. American farmers depend heavily on Canadian buyers. Billions in exports move north each year. The auto industry is even more interconnected. Supply chains cross the border multiple times before final production. Even small disruptions can create significant ripple effects. That is why, away from public attention, U.S. business groups are already expressing concern. They understand something often overlooked in political debates. Trade conflicts rarely stay contained. They expand. They affect sectors far beyond the original target. And once supply chains begin shifting, reversing the damage becomes extremely difficult. But the tension grows even more complex. While economic risks push toward de-escalation, political incentives push in the opposite direction. For Donald Trump, this situation fits into a broader narrative, presenting foreign competition as a threat, portraying the United States as being taken advantage of, and framing strong actions as necessary responses. Within that framework, backing down is not an option because it affects perception. And in this environment, perception is everything. So now two forces are colliding. Economic reality favors stability. Political momentum encourages escalation. Caught in between are industries, workers, and businesses that depend on stable cross-border trade. And the key point is this: neither side appears ready to step back. Canada is moving forward through legal channels. The United States is maintaining its position publicly. And with each passing hour, the likelihood increases that this moves from investigation to action. Once tariffs are imposed, the situation does not just intensify, it becomes fixed. And that is the point both sides are approaching. Now the situation becomes more serious. This is no longer just a legal or diplomatic issue. It is already affecting real industries. And the most concerning part is that it is happening before any official outcome. Start with aluminum. This is the core of the issue. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of aluminum to the United States. Not optional, essential. U.S. manufacturing depends on it. Aerospace, automotive, construction all rely on consistent Canadian supply. And within 2 days of the investigation, Canadian producers began seeing a pattern. Not cancellations, but hesitation. Orders delayed, contracts reviewed, concerns raised where none existed before. In global trade, hesitation can be more damaging than rejection because it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty slows everything. Think about the impact on a Canadian aluminum worker. Stable job, union protection, long standing trade relationships. Then suddenly your industry is linked to forced labor allegations. Not proven, not confirmed, just associated. That alone can disrupt operations. But aluminum is just the beginning. Softwood lumber adds another layer of complexity. This is a long-standing point of tension between the two countries. Whenever economic pressure rises in the United States, Canadian lumber often becomes a target. Tariffs, quotas, investigations, different tools, same outcome. Protect domestic industry while restricting Canadian imports. This time, however, the forced labor angle changes the narrative. It introduces a moral dimension, it questions legitimacy, and that makes the impact deeper. At the same time, U.S. housing depends heavily on Canadian lumber to keep costs manageable. Domestic production cannot fully replace it. So if imports are restricted, prices rise sharply. Housing becomes more expensive. Construction slows. And a measure intended to protect workers ends up increasing costs for consumers. That is the central contradiction in this situation. Now look at agriculture, where the political impact becomes even more immediate. Canada is one of the largest buyers of U.S. agricultural goods. Corn, soybeans, dairy, meat, entire sectors rely on that trade. The moment Canada signals possible countermeasures, those industries react. Because they have seen this before. Market access can disappear quickly. Behind the scenes, U.S. farming groups are already raising concerns. If Canada imposes tariffs or restrictions, the effects will be immediate. Contracts will be lost, surpluses will grow, prices will fall, and these impacts reach far beyond economics. They affect communities, families, and regions that depend on stable demand. But the situation becomes even more complex. While economic signals warn of risk, political messaging continues to push escalation. For Donald Trump, this reinforces a broader narrative that has been building. The idea that even close allies take advantage of the United States, that strong action is necessary, that standing firm is the right approach. And that message resonates emotionally, not analytically. It is about perception, not data. This is why resolving the situation becomes so difficult. From an economic perspective, both sides have clear reasons to step back. The risks are known, the costs are measurable. But from a political perspective, stepping back appears as weakness, and that makes compromise harder. At the same time, Mark Carney faces a different pressure. His response is not just about trade, it is about credibility. It is about showing that Canada will not accept accusations that harm its economy without evidence. And so far, that position is gaining support domestically. Political divisions are narrowing, public backing is increasing. Even groups that often disagree are aligning around a single message. Canada will defend its position. That unity changes the situation. It signals to Washington that this is not a temporary reaction. It is a sustained stance. And when both sides are reinforced by internal support, negotiation becomes more difficult, which leads to the key reality here. What we are seeing now is only the beginning. No tariffs yet, no final decisions, no formal penalties, but trade is already slowing. Trust is already weakening. Decisions are already being delayed. Now imagine what happens if this escalates further. Once actions replace warnings, the pace accelerates rapidly. Step back for a moment, because this is no longer just a dispute between two countries. It represents a broader shift in how global trade operates under pressure. For decades, U.S.-Canada relations were built on predictability. Disputes existed, but there was always an understanding that rules mattered, that agreements like NAFTA and later USMCA provided structure. That foundation is now being tested. By launching this investigation, Donald Trump has introduced uncertainty into that system. The line between legitimate oversight and strategic pressure has become blurred. And once that line fades, other countries start asking the same question. If this can happen to Canada, it can happen to anyone. That question is already spreading beyond North America. European leaders have expressed support for Canada's position, emphasizing evidence based trade actions. Asian partners are quietly evaluating their own exposure. Because this is not just about one investigation, it is about whether trade rules remain consistent or become tools of strategy. Mark Carney's approach reflects that reality. While attention is focused on the dispute, the broader strategy is taking shape. He is positioning this as a test of global trade reliability. His argument is clear. If a country can initiate a politically driven investigation without strong evidence, then no trade relationship is truly secure. That argument matters because global trade depends on trust. And once that trust weakens, countries begin adjusting. They diversify suppliers, they seek new markets, they reduce dependence on any single partner, even one as large as the United States. Now consider the long term impact. U.S. influence has always depended not just on size, but on reliability, being the central and trusted hub of global trade networks. But if that trust declines, even gradually, this shift happens over time. Companies change suppliers. Governments sign new agreements. Investment moves toward more stable environments. Each decision is small, but together they reshape the system. This is why this moment matters. It is not just about whether Canada wins a dispute or the United States proves its claims. It is about whether the trust underlying these relationships holds or begins to break. History adds important context. In the past, when the United States took strong economic action, allies protested but rarely built alternatives. That is no longer the case. Today's global system is more connected. Information moves quickly. Coordination happens faster. And countries now have more options. This means the situation is no longer just bilateral. It is becoming a signal to the entire world. A signal about how power is used, about whether rules still matter, about the future of alliances. And the outcome will influence decisions far beyond North America. If the United States continues without clear evidence, it reinforces the idea that power outweighs rules. If Canada successfully challenges the move through legal channels, it sends the opposite message, that agreements still function. Right now, however, we are in an uncertain phase. No resolution, no final outcome. Just two positions becoming more fixed while global attention increases. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to contain. Because once trust begins to erode, restoring it is far more difficult than maintaining it. Which means whatever happens next will not just resolve this dispute. It will shape how future trade conflicts unfold and whether the principles that have guided global commerce for decades continue to hold real authority or gradually give way to something fundamentally different.